My educational psychologist pioneer is Jean Piaget. He was a Swiss scientist, psychologist, and biologist. He was most famous for his development of the theory of cognitive development. I've included a important quote that I found from Jean Piaget, and he said that the principal goal of education in the schools should be creating men and women who are capable of doing new things, not simply repeating what other generations have done. Piaget's early life. Born on August 9, 1896 in Switzerland, he was his parents' first child. Rebecca was his mother, and she attributed his interest in the sciences to his own neurotic tendencies. Piaget's father was a medieval literature professor named Arthur, who was very dedicated to his studies. And this dedication to studies is a trait that Piaget began to show at a very early age. Piaget's godfather was the one who introduced him to philosophy and biology and thus merged with the epistemology. I have included a picture of Jean Piaget and his family. At 10 years old, he began studying mollusk specimens at the local natural history museum. At age 11, Piaget wrote a short scientific paper on the albino sparrow while attending his Latin high school. This paper would eventually be published. After high school graduation, Piaget studied natural sciences at the University of Neuchâtel, where he obtained a PhD in natural sciences in 1918. After a semester spent at the University of Zurich studying under Carl Jung and Paul Eugene Bleuler, Piaget developed an interest for psychoanalysis and left Switzerland for France. His early professional life was a very grand one. He spent 1 year working at the local boys' institution that was created by Alfred Binet. The institution was directed by Theodore Simon, who had developed with Alfred Binet a test for the measurement of intelligence, which would become known as the IQ test. Piaget standardized the test of intelligence. In the revised version, he allowed children to explain the logic of their incorrect answers. Piaget was more interested in why the children came to these answers than their correctness and their wrongness. He wanted to know why, and he was just fascinated by children and their thinking. He also did his first experimental studies of the growing mind while at the institution, and I have added a picture of the boys' institution there in Paris on the right. His early personal life. In 1921, Piaget became director of studies at the J.J. Rousseau Institute in Geneva at the request of Sir Ed Claparède and P. Piaget. In 1923, he married Valentine Chétonnay, and the couple had 3 children, Jacqueline, Lucien, and Laurent. Piaget studied his children's intellectual development from infancy to their language development, and him studying his own children led to his development of his stages of cognitive development. He really used his own experience with his children to develop these stages. Piaget's psychologist career. He was on several prestigious committees, and he has won several awards and has wrote books and has received very prestigious honors as well. But I've listed a few below where he was either director or was head of the board. So the first was Psychology, Sociology, and History of Science from 1925 to 1929. The History of Scientific Thinking at Geneva from 1929 to 1939, the International Bureau of Education from 1929 to 1967, Psychology and Sociology at Lausanne from 1938 to 1951, Sociology at Geneva from 1939 to 1952, Genetic and Experimental Psychology from 1941 to 1971. Piaget's psychologist career. In 1963, he was the first psychologist to make a systematic study of cognitive development. In 1936, John Piaget published The Origins of Intelligence in Children, which it took, I think it was like in 1952 is when it hit America, but he published it in England then. This book was the first of a 3-part volume on the beginning of intelligence. His contributions include a stage of theory of child cognitive development, detailed observational studies of cognition in children, and a series of simple tests to reveal different cognitive abilities. And I've included the cover of The Origins of Intelligence Children, and it is a standard reference work for students and workers in child psychology. So here's his big contribution to the educational field. Here's his stages of cognitive development. Piaget showed that young children think in different ways when compared to adults, not less, just different. According to Piaget, children are born with a very basic mental structure, genetically inherited and evolved, on which all subsequent learning and knowledge are based. The goal of the theory is to explain the mechanisms and processes by which the infant and then the child develops into an individual who can reason and think. Piaget theorized that all people pass through the same 4 stages in exactly the same order. However, as noted in our book, each person can spend a different amount of time in each stage, but the stages still follow the order. And I will get into the stages on my next slide, but this chart is really good for showing the age range, the description of the stage, and the developmental phenomenon. So birth to nearly 2 years is the sensorimotor, 2 to 6 or 7 is the pre-operational, 7 to 11 is the concrete operational, and 12 through adulthood is form operational. And if you look at these and you have been around children or you have children, you know that birth to 2, they do have stranger anxiety. And then 2 to 7, they are doing pretend play and so forth. So Jean Piaget really developed these stages thoroughly. So here's a brief description of each stage. So the first stage is the sensorimotor stage. And it's children aged 0 to 2, and they learn through motor actions, through reflexes and senses and movements. The pre-operational stage is children aged 3 to 7. They develop intelligence through the use of symbolic language, fantasy play, and natural intuition. The concrete operational stage is children aged 8 to 11, and they develop cognitively through the use of logic that is based on concrete evidence. Formal operation stage is the final stage, and that's adolescents aged 12 through 15, and they form the ability to think abstractly with more complex understandings of logic and cause and effect. Piaget also developed 4 influence factors. They are biological maturation, it's the unfolding of biological changes that are genetically programmed, activity, increasing ability to act on the environment and learn from it, social experiences, which is learning from others, and equilibration, and it's the act of searching for balance. And I have found several pictures of Piaget working with children, and I have included those. As you can see, he really was dedicated to his work. Piaget's basic tendencies in thinking. He also developed that all species inherit 2 basic invariant functions. Organization, which is the combining, arranging, recombining, and rearranging of behaviors and thoughts into coherent systems. Adaptation is the adjustment to the environment, and this happens through 2 processes: assimilation, which is fitting new information into existing schemes, and accommodation, which is altering existing schemes or creating new ones in response to new information. So Piaget's influencers, I've already mentioned them, but I wanted to more point out on how they helped him become so interested in what he studied. So Piaget studied under Carl Jung and Paul Eugene Bleuler, and 2 psychological laboratories in Zurich, Switzerland, and they both introduced him to psychoanalysis, which is the study of mental processes. And in 1920, with Theodore Simon in the Binet Laboratory, is where he developed standardized reasoning tests, which are the universal test for intelligence. So Piaget's late life to death. He was honored with the Erasmus Prize in 1972, and then he was honored with the Balzan Prize for Social and Political Sciences in 1979. And then the following year, right after he received this prize, he died on September 16, 1980 at Geneva, Switzerland. And he was 84 years old when he died of unknown causes. And something I found very interesting about Jean Piaget is he, at his Cemetery of Kings, he has an unmarked grave, and that was by request that he have an unmarked grave. Piaget's influence. Piaget's research led to the belief that every interaction establishes cognitive structure in children, and this is especially important in the classroom environment because every action that our students go through has an effect on them in our classroom and outside of the classroom. And then his theory has been influential in curriculum design, with many books and papers addressing the application of his theory to education, and I just listed some of those after. And Piaget was dismissive of the American tendency to try to speed up cognitive development. And when he was asked about this, he posed this question: is it a good thing to accelerate the learning of these concepts? And I think that is just important for us to think about, is why are we trying to rush our children and speed up their cognitive development? And then another influence is Piaget's emphasis on active involvement in learning. He also said in the same interview, you cannot teach concepts verbally. You must use a method founded on activity. He favored education based on cognitive processes rather than cognitive products. And I think that's where we have gone amiss in our American education. We are focused on the cognitive products like assessment and test rather than the processes. Piaget's theory of cognitive development has taught educators what students need to learn and how they need to learn it based on the stages the students are at. I liked this quote. His particular insight was the role of maturation, which is simply growing up, in children's increasing capacity to understand their world. They cannot undertake certain tasks until they are psychologically mature enough to do so. I think that's just a really powerful statement, that we cannot force children to do something until they are psychologically mature enough. So this is just a slide of some ways to apply Jean Piaget in the classroom from the University of Arkansas, and it's to structure pre-operational development. And it's basically all hands-on and activity and experiences for building a foundation, and just being sensitive that some students may know something and others may have a different definition for that, and that's okay. And I liked that one was making instructions relatively short and using actions as well as words, because I believe that modeling and actions are very important in the classroom. And here are my 10 sources, and that wraps up my presentation on Jean Piaget. And he really, truly was a pioneer in the educational field, because he started the belief that children learn by what stages they are at, and we cannot force them to learn something that's beyond their cognitive stage. Thank you.